My husband died and left me only an old key to a shed. His children laughed in my face. "We got everything!" I searched for that shed for 2 years. When I finally found it and opened it, I couldn't believe my eyes. Good day, dear listeners. It's Maria again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please subscribe to my channel and like this video. And also let me know in the comments which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. My name is Margaret Louise Thompson. Most people called me Maggie. For 31 years, I was Edward Thompson's wife. And for 31 years, I believe that was the most important thing I would ever be. Edward and I met at a church fundraiser in Asheville, North Carolina, in the fall of 1989. He was a widower with 2 children, Derek, who was 9, and Sandra, who was 7. I was 32, a school teacher with no children of my own, and a quiet faith that love was something you chose every day, not just once. People warned me. My mother said, "Maggie, raising another woman's children is a thankless job." My sister said, "Those kids will never accept you." I didn't listen. I was in love, and in love I was stubborn. For a long time, love was enough. Edward was a quiet, deliberate man, the kind who measured his words carefully, who fixed things around the house on Saturday mornings with a coffee cup in one hand and a wrench in the other, who always knew exactly where everything was. He ran a small hardware business that grew steadily over the decades. We weren't wealthy, but we were comfortable. We had a modest house on Birchwood Lane, a vegetable garden out back, a life that felt solid and real and entirely mine. Derek and Sandra were a different story. They were polite to me when Edward was in the room. When he wasn't, they were cold, not cruel, just distant, like I was a piece of furniture that had appeared in their childhood home and never quite fit. I tried. Lord knows I tried. I went to every school play, every soccer game. I packed lunches, helped with homework, organized birthday parties. When they grew up and moved away, I told myself it was simply the way of things. Some families blend, some don't. I made my peace with it, or tried to. Then, in the spring of 2019, Edward was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, stage 3. The doctors were cautious but realistic. We had perhaps 18 months. Those 18 months were the most intimate and exhausting of my life. I became his full-time caregiver. I drove him to appointments in Chapel Hill, organized his medications into a weekly dispenser every Sunday evening, sat beside him at 3 in the morning when the pain kept him awake and the house was very quiet. Derek and Sandra visited occasionally, holidays, the odd long weekend, but the daily weight of it fell entirely on me. I did not resent it. He was my husband. I would have done it 1,000 times over and called it a privilege. Edward died on a Thursday morning in November 2020, with his hand in mine. The weeks after were a blur. Condolences, casseroles, paperwork, phone calls I answered on autopilot. I moved through everything in a fog so thick I sometimes forgot what day it was. I was 63 years old, a retired school teacher, and I had just lost the center of my world. The reading of the will took place in December, in the office of Edward's longtime attorney, a dry, efficient man named Gerald Howe. Derek and Sandra arrived together, dressed sharply, carrying coffee cups from the shop down the street. They sat close to each other and barely glanced at me. Gerald read through the document in his careful, measured voice. The house on Birchwood Lane, to Derek and Sandra, to be sold, and the proceeds divided equally. The business, long since sold, had already been distributed through a trust whose details I hadn't fully known. The savings accounts, the investment portfolio, again, Derek and Sandra, equally. I sat very still and listened. When Gerald finished reading, he looked at me over the rim of his glasses with an expression that was not quite apologetic. "Mrs. Thompson," he said, "your husband left you one personal bequest." He reached into an envelope and slid an object across the polished table toward me. It was a key, old, heavy iron, the kind that belongs to a padlock rather than a doorknob. Attached to it by a piece of brown twine was a small paper tag, and on the tag, in Edward's handwriting, the same careful, deliberate print I had seen on grocery lists and birthday cards and the margins of library books for 31 years, were 5 words, "You'll know where." I picked it up. I turned it over in my palm. Derek laughed first. It was a short, sharp sound, not quite disbelief, not quite contempt, but something hovering unpleasantly between the two. "That's it?" he said, looking at Gerald. Sandra pressed her lips together and gazed out the window at the December street below. "I'm sorry, Maggie," she said, in the smooth, cool tone people use when they are not sorry at all. I said nothing. I put the key in my purse. I thanked Gerald. I stood up, put on my coat, and walked out of the office and down 2 flights of stairs and out into the gray December air. I sat in my car in the parking garage for perhaps 15 minutes without starting the engine. Then I drove home. That night, I sat at the kitchen table, the kitchen that would soon no longer be mine, and held the key under the lamp. You'll know where. But I didn't know. That was the maddening thing. I turned it over and over and could not place it. And then, very faintly, something stirred. A memory. Edward, maybe 15 years before, mentioning in passing a property his father had owned, land somewhere in Vermont. A small piece of farmland Robert Thompson had bought in another era and never developed. Edward had mentioned it only once or twice, always briefly, always changing the subject before I could ask much. I had assumed, vaguely, that it had been sold long ago. But what if it hadn't? What if Edward, deliberate, careful Edward, who always knew exactly where everything was, had been keeping something for me all along? I held the key tighter and felt, for the first time since November, something other than grief. I felt curious. The house on Birchwood Lane was mine until the end of February. Derek had made that clear through Gerald Howe's office. Politely worded, legally precise, utterly merciless, 3 months to vacate. I had lived in that house for 27 years. I had painted the kitchen twice, replanted the rosebed along the fence 3 times, watched every neighbor's children grow up and move away through those windows. I spent the first weeks of January making lists. It's what I do when I'm afraid. I organize. I cataloged what was truly mine: my clothing, my books, my mother's china wrapped in dish towels in the back of the pantry, the small mahogany jewelry box Edward had given me on our 10th anniversary. What I did not own: the furniture, the appliances, the house itself. The vegetable garden I had tended for 2 decades. The oak tree in the backyard that Edward and I had planted together in the spring after our wedding, which was now 30 feet tall and shaded half the lawn. My finances, laid out plainly on a legal pad, were sobering. A retired teacher's pension, $1,840 per month. Social Security, $610 per month. Personal savings, approximately $14,000. That was the sum total of my financial independence after 31 years of marriage. No joint accounts in my name. Edward had managed the finances, which I had never questioned because I had trusted him completely, and because trust in a good marriage is not foolishness. But trust also does not pay rent. I ran the numbers over and over. A one-bedroom apartment in Asheville, even on the modest end, would run at least $950 per month. Add utilities, food, insurance, the prescription medications my arthritis required, and the arithmetic came out wrong every single time. I had perhaps 18 months, maybe 2 years, before the savings were gone. Is it shameful to admit I cried? Not from self-pity. I have never had much patience for self-pity, but from the particular exhaustion of standing at 63 years old at the edge of a life you thought was settled and looking out into open air. But underneath the fear, like a pilot light that refuses to go out no matter how cold the room gets, was the key. I had moved it from my purse to the kitchen counter, next to the coffee maker, where I would see it every morning. I had begun to treat it as a kind of anchor. Whatever Edward had meant, he had meant something. He was not a careless man. He was not sentimental without purpose. You'll know where. He had chosen every word. I needed to find that barn. On the second Thursday of January, I drove to the county library on a gray, cold morning and sat down at a public computer terminal. I am not ignorant of technology. I had learned my way around a computer in my last decade of teaching, but I was deliberate and careful, working through each step methodically. Vermont property records. Calder County, the name Edward had mentioned, or something like it. His father's name, Robert James Thompson. I paid for a guest subscription to a digitized land record archive and began searching. It took 3 hours and 2 cups of terrible vending machine coffee. I found it. Robert James Thompson. A parcel of land, 12 acres, in the township of Millhaven, Calder County, Vermont. Purchased in 1961. No subsequent record of sale, no transfer of ownership, which meant Edward had inherited it and had never sold it, and had never mentioned it in any estate document. My hand was trembling slightly when I wrote down the parcel number in my notebook, not from weakness, from something closer to recognition, the feeling of a puzzle piece settling into a place that was always meant to receive it. I sat for a moment in the library's quiet warmth and looked at what I had written. 12 acres in Millhaven, Vermont, owned by Robert Thompson in 1961, inherited by Edward, never sold. And somewhere on that land, because why else would a man leave his wife a heavy iron key with a note that said you'll know where? There was something worth finding. That evening, I called an attorney, not Gerald Howe. Gerald Howe had interests that were not necessarily mine, a fact I had come to understand quietly and without drama. I found a different attorney through an online search, choosing based on 2 criteria. She practiced family and estate law, and her reviews used words like tenacious and doesn't back down. Her name was Rachel Okafor. I left a message. She called me back the following morning at 8 o'clock before I had finished breakfast, which told me something useful about her. "Tell me everything," she said, after I explained the basic outline. I did. The will, the key, the tag, what I'd found in the property records. When I finished, there was a pause on Rachel's end that lasted just long enough to mean she was thinking carefully rather than stalling. "Mrs. Thompson," she said, "if that property was never formally transferred or sold, it would still be part of your husband's estate. The critical question is whether it appears in the will." "It doesn't," I said. "I've read the will 3 times. There is no mention of Vermont, no mention of any land." Another pause, shorter this time. "That's interesting," she said. "That's very interesting." We arranged to meet in her office 2 days later. Rachel was in her early 40s, brisk, sharp-eyed, with close-cropped hair and the particular energy of someone who fills a room without overwhelming it. She had already pulled the will and was cross-referencing it against public estate records before I arrived. "The Vermont parcel isn't mentioned," she confirmed across her desk, which means it was either genuinely overlooked during estate planning, which would be a significant oversight for any competent attorney, or it was deliberately excluded. "Or someone knew about it and didn't want it found," I said. She looked at me steadily over the edge of the document. "Or that," she agreed. My plan was still simple at that point. Go to Vermont, find the property, find whatever was on it, open what needed opening. Do all of this before Derek and Sandra understood what I was looking for. There are times in life when the right move is the quiet one. I had learned that much in 31 years of managing a household, a classroom, and a marriage. You don't announce your intentions, you simply act. I did not share the Vermont portion of my plan with Rachel yet. Some things you keep close, at least for a while, until you know what you're holding. Rachel filed a formal inquiry with the probate court in late January, a petition requesting a full accounting of all assets associated with Edward Thompson's estate. It was, she explained to me calmly, a standard legal instrument available to any surviving spouse. On paper, it looked exactly like what it was, a widow seeking clarity about what her husband had owned. Nothing stays quiet in a family like this one. Derek called me on a Wednesday evening, 3 days after the filing. He did not bother with pleasantries. "I hear you got yourself a lawyer," he said. "Hello, Derek," I said. "What exactly are you hoping to accomplish? The will is valid. Gerald reviewed it. There is nothing to contest." "I'm not contesting the will," I said, which was technically true. A short silence, the kind that comes when someone is recalibrating. "Then what are you doing?" "Making sure I understand the full scope of what was left," I said. "Isn't that a reasonable thing for a widow to want?" He hung up without answering. 45 minutes later, Sandra sent me a text. "We think it would be best to resolve everything without attorneys involved. It's what Dad would have wanted." I read it twice. I put my phone face down on the table and did not reply. The phone calls told me 2 important things. First, Derek and Sandra were monitoring developments more closely than I had expected. Second, they were nervous. People who have nothing to hide do not grow nervous at a routine probate inquiry. They grow curious, perhaps. They do not grow nervous. I accelerated my timeline. In the first week of February, I booked a room at a bed and breakfast in Mill Haven, Vermont, a converted farmhouse listed on a travel website run by a woman named Helen. I packed a bag, placed the key in the inner pocket of my winter coat where it rested against my ribs, and told no one except Rachel, who made me promise to document everything photographically. Vermont in February is not welcoming. The drive from Asheville took 2 full days. I stopped overnight in Hartford, Connecticut, slept in a motel that smelled of industrial cleaning fluid, and drove the second leg through a landscape progressively blanketed in white, rolling hills, dark pine forests, the kind of country that is beautiful in a way that does not solicit your admiration, but simply assumes it. I arrived in Mill Haven on a Tuesday afternoon. The town was small and unhurried. A gas station, a diner called the Mill Haven Cup, a white clapboard church, a post office that appeared to double as a general store. Helen, the bed and breakfast owner, was a compact woman in her 60s with a practical warmth that asked nothing of you and offered quite a bit. She showed me to a room with a patchwork quilt and a window overlooking a field that was entirely snow. The next morning, I put on my wool coat and my sensible boots and went to the Mill Haven Town Assessor's office. Behind the counter was a young man with a reddish beard and no particular suspicion of me. I was a 63-year-old woman with a notebook and a polite manner, which is precisely the demographic that small-town clerks find least alarming. I explained that I was researching a property that had belonged to my late father-in-law. Robert Thompson, I said. A 12-acre parcel somewhere north of Route 9. The clerk typed for perhaps 45 seconds. Got it, Thompson parcel. Still in the family name. Your husband? That's right, I said. Taxes get paid automatically. Has for years. Electronic transfer comes in every year in April. Nobody's done anything with the land as far as we can see. He printed a topographic map and circled the property access point in red pen. Gravel track goes in from Route 9 about a quarter mile. Not maintained in winter, but passable if you've got decent tires and you go slow. I thanked him. I folded the map into my coat pocket next to the key. I drove out that afternoon in the pale, flat light of a February Vermont sky. The gravel track was exactly where the map said it would be, set back behind a row of bare maple trees, rutted but passable. I drove slowly, watching the bare tree line open ahead of me, and felt my heartbeat doing something irregular that I chose to interpret as anticipation rather than fear. And then I saw it. A barn. Old wooden, weathered to silver gray by decades of New England winters. Solidly built. Post and beam construction. The old way. The kind that lasts because it was built by people who expected it to last. A heavy iron padlock on the main door. The exact style of lock that the key in my pocket had been made for. I sat in the car for a full minute. The engine ticked. Outside, the snow was unbroken around the barn. No footprints, no tire tracks, nothing except the faint outline of the gravel track I had followed in. Whatever was here, no one had been here recently. I got out of the car. My boots broke through the crust of the snow. I walked to the barn door with steps that were deliberate and unhurried, even though my heart was doing its irregular thing again. I took the key from my coat pocket with fingers that were steady despite the cold. I fit the key into the lock. It turned, smoothly as if it had been used yesterday. I pushed the door open and stepped inside, and I did not believe my eyes. The barn was dry. It smelled of motor oil and old timber and something sweet underneath. I identified it, eventually, as the particular smell of canvas left undisturbed for a long time. The winter light came through two high, small windows and fell across the shapes inside in pale, dusty columns. Cars. 4 of them, parked side by side under heavy canvas tarps. I approached the nearest one and pulled back the corner of the cover. A 1967 Ford Mustang Fastback, navy blue, in what appeared, even to my non-specialist eye, to be extraordinary condition. I moved to the second, a 1969 Chevrolet Camaro Z/28, red and sleek in the dim light. The third, a 1970 Dodge Challenger R/T, orange, massive, and purposeful. The fourth, parked slightly apart from the others like a guest of honor, a 1965 Shelby Cobra, silver gray, low-slung, so beautiful it seemed impossible that it had been sitting in a Vermont barn for 30 years. Along the far wall on a wooden workbench between 2 sets of shelves stocked with cleaning supplies and battery maintainers, I found a metal box, unlocked. Inside the box, a manila envelope. Inside the envelope, 2 handwritten pages on notarized letterhead dated 14 months before Edward's death. Maggie, it began, in his careful print. If you're reading this, you found the key. I always knew you would. I sat down on a wooden stool beside the workbench and read Edward's letter twice, from beginning to end without moving. He explained everything. The cars had belonged to his father, Robert Thompson, assembled quietly over 20 years, not as an investment, but out of a pure, unhurried love for American automotive craft. Robert had stored them on the Vermont property in the early 1980s, when he could no longer maintain them properly himself. After Robert died, Edward had arranged for a local mechanic, a man named Paul Greer, to check on the barn and the cars twice a year. Oil changes, battery maintenance, the work required to keep a machine alive even when it isn't running. "I kept this separate for a reason," Edward wrote. "I want this to be yours, Maggie, yours alone. Not because I do not love my children, but because you gave me 31 years of your life, your patience, your care, your mornings and your nights, and every difficult hour at the end when you never once made me feel like a burden. You deserve something that is simply entirely yours. I had the collection appraised last year. The paperwork is in the envelope. Paul Greer can put you in touch with the right people. Don't let anyone talk you out of it." He signed it. "All my love. Edward." The appraisal document was folded behind the letter. I unfolded it with steady hands. The assessed value of the collection, based on a private appraisal conducted in 2019 by a specialist firm in Connecticut, was $683,000. I sat in that barn for a long time. The only sound was the wind pressing against the old wooden walls, and very faintly, my own breathing. Then I took out my phone and called Rachel. She was calm, methodical, completely unrattled. She told me what to do in a precise, numbered sequence. Photograph everything. The exterior of the barn, the padlock, the door, the cars with their covers off, the covers folded, the workbench, the metal box, the envelope, every page of the letter, the appraisal document. Front, back, every corner. She told me to photograph the key in the lock. She told me to keep the originals on my person until I was back in North Carolina. I spent 2 hours documenting. Then I locked the barn, put the key back in my coat pocket, and drove to the bed and breakfast as the Vermont afternoon turned purple and cold around me. I slept better that night than I had in months. 2 days later, Derek called. It was mid-morning. His voice was different this time, lower, stripped of the casual condescension he usually carried, harder, more careful. "We know you went to Vermont," he said. I felt cold move through me, but I kept my voice level. "Do you?" Paul Greer called Sandra. A pause. He thought he was being helpful. Of course. Paul Greer had no reason to keep my visit confidential. He didn't know the situation, didn't know what the barn meant, didn't know anything except that a woman he'd never met had driven up to a barn he'd been maintaining for years and started photographing things. It was a reasonable thing to mention. "You need to understand something," Derek continued. His voice had the measured quality of someone reading from a prepared position. "Whatever is in that barn, whatever you think you found, it's part of Dad's estate. You don't have any special claim. The will is the will. You might want to share that theory with my attorney," I said. "Maggie." The hardness softened, just slightly, in the way that is more dangerous than hardness. "This is family. Don't make this ugly." I thought about the December morning in Gerald Howe's office. I thought about the sound Derek's laugh had made, short, sharp, contemptuous. I thought about sitting at my kitchen table at night with $14,000 to my name and a key under the lamp. "Derek," I said quietly, "you laughed at me. Across a conference table 3 weeks after I buried your father, you laughed at me. Don't speak to me about family." I ended the call. 3 hours later, I heard a car pull into the bed and breakfast's small parking area. I looked out the window and felt something tighten in my chest. Sandra. She had driven, or flown to Burlington and rented a car, more likely, and she stood in the parking area in her camel coat, looking up at the building with the precise, composed expression of someone who has rehearsed their face during the drive. She knocked on my door. I opened it. She looked at me with something I could not quite name, a version of concern, carefully constructed, worn over something much less sympathetic. "We need to talk," she said. "We'll talk through our attorneys," I said, and closed the door. I heard her stand in the hall for a long moment, the sound of measured breathing. Then her footsteps going back down the stairs, slow and deliberate, the footsteps of someone who wants to be heard leaving. I sat down on the edge of the bed and allowed myself 5 minutes of something close to shaking. Not from fear, exactly, from the physical reality of confrontation, the way it travels through your body whether you want it to or not. Then I breathed through it. What had Sandra expected? That I would open the door, sit down with her, be reasonable? Or had she come simply to see what I knew, to read my face, assess how much of a threat I actually was? I called Rachel that night from the small writing desk in my room. "They know," I said. "Sandra drove up. How did she seem?" I thought about Sandra's face in the doorway, the careful composure, the something beneath it. "Rattled," I said. "She was rattled. She was hiding it, but she was rattled." "Good," Rachel said simply. "That means they're worried. Extend your stay if you can. I want you to visit the assessor's office one more time tomorrow and get certified copies of the property records. We're building a paper trail." I booked 3 more nights with Helen, who asked no questions, and refilled my coffee without being asked. The next morning, I went back to the assessor's office, got my certified copies, and drove past the barn one more time on my way back. Not stopping, just looking. It stood in the winter light exactly as it had 2 days before. Solid, patient, waiting, as it had waited for years, for whoever would come for it. I was the one who had come. Rachel moved quickly. Within 10 days of my return from Vermont, she had filed a motion with the probate court arguing that the Vermont property and its contents constituted a distinct testamentary gift, separate from and not governed by the will. The argument rested on 3 foundations: the property's deliberate omission from the estate accounting, the notarized letter as evidence of Edward's clear intent, and the question of whether the estate had been fully and honestly disclosed to the court in the first place. It was a strong motion. Rachel was careful to tell me it was not a guaranteed one. Derek and Sandra moved quickly, too. They retained their own attorney within the week, a man named Philip Brent, whose name Rachel mentioned with the measured respect of someone who knows their opponent. He filed a counter motion arguing that the Vermont property fell under the estate's general residuary clause and should be distributed according to the will's existing terms. He cited 3 cases. He was, Rachel said, very good at what he did, and so began the waiting. I moved into a small apartment on the east side of Asheville in early February. 1 bedroom, 2nd floor, a view of a parking lot, and beyond it, a thin strip of bare trees that I could watch through the kitchen window while I had my morning coffee. It was nothing like Birchwood Lane. It was quiet and clean and entirely mine, and at first the silence in the evenings was almost unbearable. On a Thursday afternoon in March, Derek called again. The tone had shifted entirely. The hardness from our last conversation was gone, replaced by something studied and warm, the voice of a man who has decided to try a different approach. "Maggie," he said, "Sandra and I have been talking. We think we've been handling this badly. We want to make things right." I said nothing. I let him talk. He talked for 4 minutes. He talked about grief, his grief, which was real, I believe that, and about how loss makes people act in ways they wouldn't otherwise. He talked about how much his father had meant to him. He talked about how he and Sandra had discussed the situation and agreed that a court battle was not what Edward would have wanted. And then, "We'd like to offer you a settlement. $50,000 paid directly to you outside of the estate proceedings, in exchange for withdrawing your motion." A pause. "It's a generous offer, Maggie, given the uncertainties of the legal process." I looked out my kitchen window at the parking lot, at the thin strip of bare trees beyond it. $50,000. I was a woman with $14,000 in savings and a monthly deficit that kept me awake some nights. $50,000 was not a small number. Was it enough? Was it fair? Was it wise to keep fighting when Rachel herself had called the outcome uncertain? I let the silence stretch. "I'll think about it," I said. I had no intention of taking it, but I had learned, over 31 years of marriage, over 32 years of managing classrooms full of children who had not yet learned to hide what they wanted, that it is almost always better to let the other person believe they might win. I called Dorothy Marsh that evening. Dorothy had been my closest friend since we taught 3rd grade together at Riverside Elementary in the mid-90s. She was blunt and funny and completely unimpressed by anyone's pretensions, including mine. She had sat with me through Edward's illness, through the funeral, through the December afternoon when I called her from the car in the parking garage after the will reading and told her about the key. I told her about the offer. There was a pause. Then, $50,000. Yes. The cars are worth, what did you tell me? The appraisal said $683,000. So he's offering you less than 8% of what's yours and calling it generous. It was not a question. Dorothy's voice had the quality of someone reading a particularly stupid answer off a student's test paper. "He doesn't think it's definitively mine yet," I said. "No," Dorothy said. "He's afraid it might be. There's a difference, Maggie. One of those is confidence. The other is fear." She paused. "Don't you dare take that money." I laughed. It came from somewhere deep in the chest. The kind of laugh that doesn't ask permission first, the kind I hadn't had in months. It surprised me, the warmth of it. "I'm not going to take it," I said. "Good." I could hear her settling back in whatever chair she was sitting in. "Now tell me how you're doing. The real answer." I told her the real answer, which was that I was afraid some evenings and tired in a way that was different from ordinary tiredness, and that I missed Edward in ways that had nothing to do with the barn or the cars or the legal proceedings, that I missed sitting across from him at breakfast, that I missed his handwriting, which I now saw only in a letter in a metal box in a Vermont barn. Dorothy listened to all of it. She didn't try to fix any of it, which is the mark of a truly good friend. "Come to dinner Sunday," she said when I finished. "I'll make the chicken thing you like. Bring nothing." After I hung up with Dorothy, I called Rachel. "They offered me $50,000 to drop the motion," I said. "I know," Rachel said. "Philip Brent's office contacted mine an hour ago with the formal version." A pause. "I want to be transparent with you, Maggie. We have a good case. We don't have a guaranteed case. The letter is compelling, but handwritten notarized bequests occupy complicated legal territory. The judge will matter. The specifics will matter." "I understand," I said. "So what do you want to do?" I held the key in my hand. I had taken it off the kitchen counter that morning and put it in my pocket, not for any reason I could easily explain, but because carrying it steadied me. It was the last object Edward had touched, with deliberate purpose, before everything went sideways. What did he know when he prepared all of this? He knew his children. He knew 31 years into our marriage exactly how this would go. He had planned accordingly. "I want to fight," I said, "all the way." Rachel's voice, when she replied, was quiet and certain. "Good," she said. "Then let's fight." They came on a Saturday morning in early April, unannounced. I was making coffee when I heard the knock. 2 sharp, precise raps that did not quite manage to sound casual. I went to the door and opened it, and there they were. Derek in a navy blazer and khakis, Sandra in her camel coat, both of them arranged into expressions of careful, open goodwill, like people who have practiced looking reasonable in the mirror. I looked at them for a moment. Then I stepped back and let them in. I let them in because I was curious, and because I have never been a woman who runs from things she needs to understand. You cannot know your opponent by avoiding them. I knew that. They sat together on my second-hand sofa. I sat across from them in Edward's old armchair, the one piece of furniture from Birchwood Lane that had been permitted to come with me, probably because it was too worn to attract a buyer. I put my coffee on the side table and waited. Derek started. He was good at this. Smooth, reasonable, framing everything as mutual concern. He spoke about Edward's intentions, about the importance of family unity, about the emotional cost of prolonged litigation. He said the word exhausting several times. He talked about how a courtroom battle would be difficult for everyone, himself included, and how he had lain awake at night troubled by the distance between us. He was persuasive in the way of people who have been persuasive their whole lives and have never had to question whether their persuasion was honest. I listened. I drank my coffee. Then Sandra took her turn, and Sandra was always the more dangerous of the two. Where Derek was smooth, she was precise. She found the particular pressure points in an argument and pressed them gently, almost delicately, the way you'd test a bruise. She talked about what Edward would have wanted. She talked about how much it hurt her that I had hired an attorney, that I had gone to Vermont without telling anyone, that I had made this adversarial. She said the word with a small, wounded expression, as if I had initiated the conflict and she had simply responded to it. And then, quietly, carefully, almost like an afterthought, "Maggie, we all know how much you did for Dad at the end, how hard those years were, but you have to understand, we were his children, his real family." There it was. I had been waiting for it. I had known, somewhere beneath everything, that it would come to this, the thing they had always believed but had never, before this moment, said out loud to my face. His real family, as opposed to me, as opposed to the woman who had spent 31 years and the final 18 months of his life, and every 3 a.m. hour that his children did not witness. I set down my coffee cup. I looked at Sandra with complete steadiness. "Sandra," I said, "I know what you're doing. I want you to know it won't work." I paused. Not the appeal to family, not the suggestion that Edward wouldn't have wanted this, not the implication that I was something less than his wife. None of it. Sandra's expression flickered, just slightly. "I found the barn," I continued. "I read the letter. Edward chose to leave me something separate and deliberate, and he did it because he knew exactly how this conversation would go. He knew you both better than you knew he did." Derek's smooth reasonableness cracked at the edges. His jaw tightened. "You're making a mistake," he said, and the warmth was completely gone now. "Philip has worked with this judge before. You don't know what you're walking into." Was it a bluff? I turned the question over in my mind as I looked at him. Possibly, probably, but possibly not. "Then I'll find out," I said. Sandra stood first. She looked at me for a long moment, not with the contempt I might have expected, and not with calculation, something rawer than that, a kind of frustrated disbelief, the look of someone who entered a room expecting to win and is leaving without having won and cannot entirely account for why. "Fine," she said quietly. "Have it your way." They left. I heard their car start in the parking lot below my window and drive away. I locked the door and stood in the middle of my small apartment, and I will not pretend I was entirely unafraid. Derek's comment about the judge had settled somewhere uncomfortable in my chest, and it sat there for the rest of the afternoon. Philip has worked with this judge before, turning itself over like a stone. Was it true? Did it matter? Was there something Rachel needed to know? I called her that evening and told her about the visit. She listened without interrupting. "Don't speak with them again without me present," she said immediately. "If they contact you, redirect to my office." "I will," I said, but I needed to hear them. I needed to know what they were going to say. "And now you know." "Now I know," I said. "Derek mentioned you should look into whether Philip Brent has any prior relationship with the judge assigned to our case." A pause. "I'll look into it," Rachel said. "Thank you, Maggie." After I hung up, I sat in Edward's armchair in the quiet of my apartment and let the fear do what it needed to do. I didn't fight it. I had learned, in the 18 months of caregiving, that fear does less damage when you let it move through you rather than pressing it down. But alongside the fear was something else, something that had been growing since that December afternoon in Gerald Howe's office, slow and steady as a plant, finding its way toward light, an anger that was not hot or reactive, but cold and clean and entirely purposeful. His real family. After 31 years. Every time I felt afraid, I thought of those 3 words, and every time I thought of them, the fear contracted slightly and the resolve expanded to fill the space. I was not his real family. Fine. Watch what I do anyway. The hearing was set for the 2nd week of May. Asheville in May is beautiful. The dogwoods are past their peak, but the oaks are fully leafed, and the light is the particular warm gold of a southern spring that makes even ordinary things look significant. I noticed all of this on the drive to the courthouse, and I noticed it consciously, deliberately, because I had decided that whatever happened inside, I was going to arrive as someone who had looked at the morning and found it good. Rachel met me on the courthouse steps. She was in a charcoal blazer, organized and steady. She gave me a look that communicated, without words, calm, sharp, let me lead. Derek and Sandra arrived 5 minutes after we did, with Philip Brent. Brent was exactly as he had sounded in reputation, silver-haired, at ease in courtrooms, in the way that some people are at ease only in places where they have repeatedly won. He shook Rachel's hand with professional cordiality and did not look at me. The judge was Honorable Diane Cross, mid-60s, reading glasses on a beaded chain, an expression of patient and impartial attention. I liked her immediately, though I knew that was not the point. Philip Brent presented first. He was clear, organized, and persuasive. The Vermont property was an estate asset. The will had been properly executed and witnessed. The letter, while clearly authored by Edward Thompson, did not meet the formal requirements of a testamentary codicil and had no binding legal force. The vehicle collection should be distributed per the will's terms. He cited precedent. He was the kind of attorney who makes you feel, listening to him, that the answer is obvious and has always been obvious, and the other side is simply causing unnecessary trouble. Then Rachel stood up. She began not with the letter, but with the property records. She demonstrated methodically that the Vermont parcel had never appeared in any financial disclosure provided to the estate court. Not in the initial inventory, not in any amended filing. She presented the certified property records I had obtained from the Mill Haven assessor's office. She presented documentation showing that Edward Thompson had been paying the Vermont property taxes through an automatic transfer for 17 consecutive years. 17 years, throughout which this asset had never been disclosed. Philip Brent objected twice. Judge Cross overruled once and noted the other for the record. Then Rachel presented Edward's letter. She read it aloud slowly, in a voice that was clear and without theatrical emphasis. The words were enough on their own. When she reached the line, "I want this to be yours, Maggie. Yours alone." I watched Sandra look down at the table. I watched Derek's jaw set. Then Rachel said, "Your Honor, I'd like to present a corroborating witness statement." She submitted the letter. Not from me, from Paul Greer. I had known about Paul Greer's statement for only 24 hours before the hearing. Rachel had tracked him down 3 weeks earlier and had a long conversation with him. Paul Greer had a conscience, it turned out, and had been troubled since my visit to the barn. Troubled by the call he'd made to Sandra. Troubled by what he suspected the situation might be. His written statement described a conversation he'd had with Edward Thompson in the summer of 2018 during one of Edward's visits to Vermont. Edward had told him directly the collection was intended for his wife. He had made separate arrangements. He trusted Paul to keep the cars maintained until she came for them. Paul had written this down in his personal shop log at the time, dated, initialed, and Rachel had obtained the log as corroborating documentation. Philip Brent objected strenuously. Judge Cross overruled. What happened next is the part I have turned over in my mind many times since, because I want to remember it precisely. Under Rachel's examination, Derek was asked whether he had ever, prior to my visit to Vermont, known of the existence of the Vermont property. Derek said he had not. Rachel presented a document. It was a photocopy of a page from a folder of Edward's personal papers. Papers that Derek had helped organize during Edward's illness, which Derek had confirmed in an earlier deposition. The page was a property tax notice for the Mill Haven parcel, dated 2018, with a handwritten note at the top. Vermont Dad's Land, keep paying, in Edward's handwriting. Filed in a folder labeled Property in Edward's home office. "Mr. Thompson," Rachel said pleasantly, "you helped organize your father's papers during his illness. This document was in the property folder you helped organize. Can you explain why you said you had no prior knowledge of the Vermont property?" A pause that lasted several seconds too long. "I may have seen it," Derek said. "I didn't remember it." "You may have seen a property tax notice for a 12-acre parcel you claim you didn't know existed, and you didn't remember it." "That's correct." Rachel let the silence sit for a moment. Then she moved on. Sandra was asked about the timeline of when Derek had told her about Vermont. She said he had told her 3 months ago, after my visit to the barn. But Derek had said in an earlier answer that he had shared the document with Sandra during the illness. It was a small inconsistency, a gap of perhaps 2 years in their timeline. Small, but in a courtroom where every detail is material, small inconsistencies are not small. Judge Cross made no ruling that day. She said she would consider the arguments and issue a written decision within 30 days. When I walked out of that courthouse into the May afternoon, Rachel fell into step beside me and said nothing for half a block. Then she said quietly, "That went well." I looked up at the sky, blue and high and warm, the kind of sky that seems to belong to no particular problem or worry but simply to itself. "Yes," I said, "it did." Judge Cross issued her written decision on a Thursday morning, 22 days after the hearing. I was at my kitchen table when Rachel called at 8:15. "Maggie," she said, "we won." "All of it?" I asked. "All of it." Judge Cross ruled that the Vermont property had been deliberately excluded from the estate accounting, a material omission that undermines the integrity of the estate proceeding. She found Edward's letter, combined with Paul Greer's testimony and the dated shop log, to constitute clear and convincing evidence of testamentary intent. The property and the vehicle collection were mine. She also referred Gerald Howe's conduct to the North Carolina State Bar. He had known about the Vermont property for years and chosen to say nothing. The review cost him his license. I sat at my kitchen table for a long time after Rachel's call. Then I cried. Not from sadness, but from the exhaustion of having held everything tightly for so long and finally being permitted to let it go. I drove back to Millhaven in June. I met Paul Greer in person, a quiet man with work-roughened hands and a direct gaze. He apologized for having called Sandra after my first visit. "You didn't know," I said, "and you made it right. That's what matters." The auction was held in September. The Mustang, the Camaro, and the Challenger sold above appraisal. The Shelby Cobra attracted the most attention and sold for considerably more than expected. Total proceeds, $814,000. After fees and taxes, approximately $640,000. Derek and Sandra filed an appeal. It was denied within 6 weeks. I bought a house, 3 bedrooms, a front porch, 2 old maple trees in the backyard. I placed the metal box on my bookshelf and hung the iron key beside the front door. It felt like home. The summer after the auction was the first summer in years in which I woke up without a weight sitting on my chest. I planted a garden, tomatoes, zucchini, sunflowers that made me smile every morning through the kitchen window. Dorothy came over every Sunday and we drank coffee on the front porch and argued about books. In October, I walked the Outer Banks beaches with my sister in the early mornings, just the two of us and the low gold light and the sound of the Atlantic. I put $15,000 into a scholarship fund at the school where Dorothy and I had taught, another 10 toward the local food bank. It felt right to let some of what Edward had given me move outward. As for Derek and Sandra, plainly without satisfaction. Derek's restaurant in Raleigh closed 14 months after opening. Sandra bought a house in Charlotte, sold it at a loss, and lost her job to restructuring. I felt no triumph, only a quiet sorrow for the people they might have been. 8 months after the auction, Sandra texted, "I hope you're well." I typed back, "I am. I hope you find your footing." She didn't respond. The key hangs by my front door. Most mornings, my hand touches it in passing, a small reminder of the thread I followed through the dark and of the woman I became. The barn is empty now, but I carry it with me everywhere I go.